The rhythmic, metallic hiss of an automated ventilator is a terrifying thing to wake up to when your eyes won't open. For what felt like hours, there was only that sound. Hiss, click, exhale. Along with the dull, pervasive ache of a body that felt less like flesh and bone and more like hollow concrete, I tried to move my fingers. Nothing. I tried to twitch my jaw. A wave of white-hot static flared behind my eyelids. Then came the voices. They weren't soft. They weren't the comforting, hushed tones of nurses tending to a recovering patient. They were sharp, frantic, and transactional. "The vitals are stabilizing too fast," a man's voice whispered. It was deep, sterile, and entirely devoid of empathy. "The sedative cocktail is wearing off. If he agitates, the arterial line will blow and we lose the entire harvest." "Then double the dose," a second voice snapped. My heart hammered against my ribs. A sudden, violent spike that set off a high-pitched beep on a monitor somewhere to my left. The second voice belonged to a woman, a voice I had listened to every single morning for the last 7 years. It was Alana, my wife. "I can't just pump him full of propofol indefinitely, Alana," the man hissed back. His marrow was already straining to keep up with the extraction schedule. "We took another 800 milliliters this morning. If his red blood cell count drops below the critical threshold, his organs will begin to shut down. I'm a concierge physician, not an executioner. My clients pay $20,000 a pint because it's pristine, unadulterated Rh-null blood. If he dies, the well goes dry." "We have 2 more weeks to cover the margin call, Dr. Silas," Alana said, her voice dropping into a cold, terrifyingly pragmatic register. "You get your 20% cut. Just keep him under until the offshore transfer clears. He doesn't feel anything anyway." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the tubes from my throat, leap from the bed, and wrap my hands around both of their necks. But my body remained a paralyzed cage, as a cold, icy fluid began to pump into the IV line in my right arm, dragging me back down into a dark, suffocating fog. One final thought burned through my fading consciousness. She wasn't mourning me. She was draining me. To understand how a senior credit risk assessment manager at a premier Manhattan wealth firm ends up strapped to an off-grid medical bed as a living commodity, you have to understand the mathematics of risk. My name is Gavin. In my profession, I don't look at human beings. I look at variables. I look at debt-to-income ratios, hidden liabilities, and the probability of catastrophic failure. For over a decade, my job at Vance & Sterling was to predict when people were going to ruin themselves and protect the firm's capital from their fallout. I was meticulous. I was unbreakable. I lived a life dictated by strict, unyielding protocols. My personal life reflected that same precision. Our brownstone in Brooklyn was bought under a triple-vetted fixed mortgage. My savings accounts were laddered into high-yield bonds, and my health was monitored with the same corporate scrutiny, partially because of a rare biological quirk. I possess Rh-null blood. It's a genetic anomaly so scarce that fewer than 50 people on the entire planet have it. It is the ultimate universal donor blood, capable of saving anyone with a rare subtype, but highly dangerous for me, because if I ever needed a transfusion, only another Rh-null carrier could provide it. I kept a private supply banked at a secure facility in Manhattan, treating it like any other high-value asset. Alana, however, was the one variable I failed to audit. We met at a charity gala in the Hamptons. She was vibrant, spontaneous, and possessed a magnetic energy that countered my rigid, analytical nature. She worked in luxury art consultancy, or so I thought. In reality, Alana was a high-functioning addict, though her drug of choice wasn't a substance. It was the market. While I spent my days mitigating risk for billionaires, Alana spent her nights sitting in our home office, quietly drowning in the volatile, unregulated world of high-leverage day trading and offshore crypto margins. She didn't want a stable, comfortable life. She wanted a spectacular fortune, and she was willing to gamble with money we didn't have to get it. Then came the accident. It was a rainy Thursday night in late November. I was walking out of our corporate headquarters on Wall Street, carrying a briefcase full of sensitive financial audits. I remember the glare of headlights bouncing off the wet asphalt. I remember the sudden, deafening roar of an accelerating engine. A black SUV mounted the curb, striking me at 40 miles an hour before speeding off into the dark. When the paramedics found me, my skull was fractured, my internal organs were hemorrhaging, and I was slipping into a deep, unresponsive coma. When I finally managed to drag myself back to consciousness, weeks after hearing that horrific conversation between Alana and Dr. Silas, the hospital room was completely different. The harsh industrial hiss of the ventilator was gone. The smell of sterile antiseptic was replaced by the faint scent of lavender and high-end wood polish. I opened my eyes. The room was opulent, a private suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a manicured courtyard. Standing at the foot of my bed, adjusting a tailored charcoal suit that looked remarkably like one of my own, was a man. He had my jawline, my eyes, my exact height and build. It was Miles, my identical twin brother. Miles was the shadow I had spent my entire adult life running away from. He was a brilliant sociopathic grifter who had vanished 6 years ago after defrauding a series of private investors in Boston, leaving a trail of ruined lives and broken promises. My parents had spent their life savings cleaning up his legal messes before they passed away, leaving me to build a clean reputation from the ashes. Miles looked down at me, a cruel, easy smile spreading across his face. He checked his watch, a vintage Patek Philippe that had belonged to our father. A watch I kept in a biometric safe in my bedroom. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Gavin," Miles said, his voice a perfect, terrifying mirror of my own. "Though I suppose we're going to have to do something about your name." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw, producing only a raspy, pathetic wheeze. Miles." "Shh, don't strain yourself," he whispered, leaning over the guardrail of the bed. "The doctors say your hematocrit levels are dangerously low. You need your rest. After all, you're the hard-working engine keeping this entire family afloat." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek, modern smartphone. He tapped the screen and held it up to my face. It was a live broadcast of a financial morning show. The news ticker at the bottom read, "Vance and Sterling approves historic $1.2 billion tech acquisition." And there, standing on the steps of the New York Stock Exchange, shaking hands with the firm's managing partners, was Miles. He was wearing my corporate ID badge. He was smiling my smile. "The firm loves me, Gavin," Miles laughed softly, pocketing the phone. "I brought them a level of aggressive, reckless ambition they've never seen from you. They think your accident gave you a new lease on life. They think you finally learned how to take a real risk." The door opened and Alana walked into the room. She didn't look at me. She went straight to Miles, slipping her hand naturally into his. "Is he fully lucid?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, though her eyes remained cold. "He's awake enough to understand the new corporate structure," Miles replied, kissing the top of her head. I looked at my wife, a desperate, silent plea burning in my chest. "Why?" I managed to choke out. "Alana? Why?" Alana finally looked down at me, her expression a mix of defensive rationalization and deep-seated greed. "You left me no choice, Gavin," she whispered. "When you went into that coma, the lenders came. I owed $4.6 million to an offshore brokerage that doesn't use lawyers to collect. They were going to kill me. They were going to take the house, your career, everything." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Then Miles showed up. He had the debts too, but he also had a plan. We couldn't access your corporate stock options or your private bank accounts without your biometrics. Your face, your fingerprints, your voice. But with you asleep in a public hospital, we were paralyzed. So we moved you. We paid a corrupt medical transport team to fake your clinical death during a simulated equipment failure. To the state of New York, Gavin, you died 4 months ago." Miles grinned, tapping his own temple. "Identical DNA is a beautiful thing, brother. I stepped right into your shoes. My face opens your phone. My fingers log into your secure workstation. I even sign your name better than you do." "But the debts were too large," Alana continued, her voice growing harder. "Miles's salary wasn't enough to pay them off in time. That's when Dr. Silas's group approached us. High net worth individuals, billionaires, politicians, elite athletes, who will pay an absolute fortune for an undocumented pure supply of Rh-null blood to enhance their longevity or survive private surgeries. You are a walking goldmine, Gavin. Your blood cleared my debts. It bought Miles his new life, and in return, we keep you comfortable here, in this beautiful, private care facility." Miles leaned down, his eyes turning dead and predatory. "So here is how this is going to play out. You are going to stay in this bed. You are going to let Dr. Silas do his work every 2 weeks. If you cooperate, you live a long, quiet, heavily sedated life of luxury. But if you try to make a scene, if you try to signal a nurse or tell anyone who you really are—" He reached out and gently tapped the IV line connected to my arm. "Well, a massive air embolism in a comatose patient's line is tragically difficult for a private clinic to prevent. Do we understand each other?" I stared at my twin brother, the cold realization washing over me that I was entirely, completely erased. I closed my eyes and nodded slowly. Miles patted my shoulder. Good lad. I have a 3 o'clock executive board meeting to run. Don't wait up. They walked out of the room, locking the heavy mahogany door behind them. I lay there in the silence, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside, entirely unaware that the darkest part of their plan hadn't even begun yet. For the next 3 weeks, I became a ghost in my own mind. I didn't fight the staff. When Dr. Silas entered with his sterile trays and heavy-gauge needles, I simply stared at the ceiling, watching the shadow of the maple trees outside shift across the plaster. I felt the slow, draining lethargy that followed each extraction. I felt my body growing weaker, my skin turning a pale, translucent gray. But while my physical body was being harvested, my mind, the mind of a senior risk analyst, was quietly waking up. I began to study the routine of the facility. It was an old, converted estate in upstate New York, operating under the guise of a private, holistic wellness retreat for the ultra-wealthy. There were no traditional hospital shifts. Dr. Silas arrived every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 9 in the morning. The nurse, a quiet, complicit woman named Evelyn, checked my vitals 3 times a day. More importantly, I noticed the flaws in their security. Because they assumed I was completely broken and physically incapacitated, they grew careless. Miles and Alana stopped visiting together. Miles was too busy playing the high-flying Wall Street executive, and Alana was consumed by her newfound freedom from debt. When Evelyn left my room on a Friday evening to attend to a high-profile guest downstairs, she left her medical cart parked just outside my door. The door wasn't fully latched, the strike plate was worn, a structural detail I had flagged on my 3rd day of clarity. Using every ounce of strength I had built up by secretly pocketing the muscle relaxants they forced me to take, I dragged my legs over the edge of the bed. My feet hit the cold floor, and my knees buckled instantly. I collapsed onto the hardwood, a gasp of agony catching in my throat. Get up, I told myself. Look at the data. Find the exploit. I crawled across the floor, my fingernails digging into the rug until I reached the door. I pushed it open an inch. The hallway was empty. On the bottom shelf of Evelyn's medical cart was a personal, unsecured iPad used for patient logging. I reached up, my hand trembling violently, and pulled the device down. It didn't require a biometric scan. It was protected by a simple 4-digit PIN. I had watched Evelyn punch it in dozens of times from my bed, 1104, the birth date of her daughter, which she kept in a framed photo on her desk. The screen illuminated. I didn't look for medical records. I looked for network connectivity. The facility operated on a private, high-speed fiber network, but to maintain absolute secrecy from federal regulatory bodies, they used a decentralized, encrypted routing system that bounced their data through offshore servers in Switzerland. To an average person, it was an untraceable ghost network. But to a risk manager who spent his life auditing international wire transfers and fraudulent corporate shells, it was a map. I logged into the guest portal using the nurse's administrative bypass credentials. I opened a secure, web-based terminal link that I had memorized during my years at Vance and Sterling, an emergency, off-grid cloud server used by our firm's compliance team to flag internal security breaches. My fingers flew across the glass screen. I checked the corporate registry for Vance and Sterling. Miles had been active, all right, but he wasn't just living my life, he was destroying it. Using my administrative access keys, which he had pulled from my personal safe, Miles had initiated a massive, highly illegal short position leverage against our own firm's primary tech acquisition. He was planning a classic corporate bust-out. He was going to drain Vance and Sterling's secondary liquidity funds into a dummy corporation registered in the Cayman Islands under Alana's maiden name, and then disappear, leaving the real Gavin to take the fall for a multi-million-dollar federal financial crime if I ever woke up. He wasn't just stealing my life. He was setting me up to be the ultimate fall guy for the largest corporate fraud of the decade. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the end of the hallway clicked. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood. I quickly cleared the browser history, shoved the iPad back onto the bottom shelf of the cart, and dragged my limp body back across the floor into my room. I pulled myself up onto the bed, sweating profusely, my heart hammering like a trapped bird, just as Evelyn walked through the door carrying a fresh dietary tray. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly as she noticed the heavy breathing and the beads of sweat on my forehead. "Your heart rate is elevated, Gavin," she said, stepping toward the monitor. "Just a nightmare," I rasped, leaning my head back against the pillow, forcing my muscles to relax. She stared at me for a long, agonizing moment before adjusting the drip on my IV. "Well, try to rest. Your brother is coming tomorrow. He says he has some final paperwork for you to sign." As she walked out and the lock clicked into place, a cold, sharp resolve settled over me. Miles was coming to finish the job. He needed my physical signature on a power of attorney transfer to finalize the Cayman Island accounts. Tomorrow was the deadline. If I didn't act within the next 12 hours, the trap would close permanently, and I would spend the rest of my miserable, drained life behind bars. Or worse, in a graveyard. The next morning, the rain was pouring against the high glass windows of the estate, casting long, weeping shadows across the room. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door unlocked. Miles walked in alone. He wasn't wearing his usual confident smirk. He looked stressed. The dark circles under his eyes told me that the high-stakes corporate espionage game was taking its toll. He carried a sleek, black leather briefcase. "Let's make this quick, Gavin," he said, slamming the briefcase onto the overbed table and popping the latches. He pulled out a stack of legal documents. "The firm's internal compliance committee is starting to sniff around the short positions. I need your wet ink signature on these corporate asset transfer waivers. Now." I sat up slowly, pretending to be weaker than I was. "And if I don't sign them, Miles? What are you going to do? Tell the world your dead brother refused to help you steal $40 million? Miles chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I don't think you understand the leverage here, bro. If you don't sign these, Alana and I leave the country tonight. We stop paying Dr. Silas. And Dr. Silas doesn't like loose ends. He'll clean this room out, and you'll become permanent fertilizer for the gardens out front. Sign the papers." He thrust a heavy Mont Blanc pen into my hand. I looked at the documents. It was a complete liquidation of my private capital, masked as an executive severance package due to medical incapacitation. "I'll sign," I said quietly, looking up into his identical eyes. "But I need one thing first. I need to see Alana. I want her to look me in the eye and tell me she wants me dead. If I'm going to give you everything, I want that piece of closure." Miles sighed, checking his watch. "She's downstairs in the administrative office, finalizing the wire routing with Silas. Fine, I'll get her. But if you play any games when we get back, I'll let Silas skip the sedatives and go straight to the airline." He turned and strode out of the room, leaving the briefcase open on the table. The moment the door clicked shut, the exhaustion vanished from my posture. I didn't touch the pen. Instead, I reached into the side pocket of his open briefcase and pulled out his corporate smartphone, the one tied directly to my identity at Vance and Sterling. Because we were identical twins, the phone's advanced facial recognition software unlocked the instant I held it up to my face. The screen flashed green. "Welcome, Gavin. I didn't call the police. The local police could be bought, or worse, they wouldn't understand the complex financial web in time to stop the wire transfers. Instead, I opened the Secure Terminal app for Vance and Sterling's internal cybersecurity and risk mitigation division, the very department I had spent 10 years building. I initiated a high-level, dual-login security anomaly protocol. I entered my private executive master key, a string of 24 alphanumeric characters that only I knew. Then, I set a timed trigger. In exactly 20 minutes, the firm's mainframes would register that Gavin was attempting to execute a multi-million-dollar offshore transfer from a terminal inside the executive boardroom in Manhattan, while simultaneously logging into the core security system from an unverified IP address in upstate New York. In the world of corporate finance, a dual login anomaly from two different geographic locations involving primary liquidity funds triggers an automatic, unbypassable Level 5 lockdown. It automatically alerts the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI's white-collar crime division, and freezes every single asset connected to the user's name globally. I hit submit. The screen blinked. Protocol staged, awaiting terminal synchronization. I shoved the phone back into the briefcase, just as the door opened again. Miles walked in, followed by Alana. She was wearing a designer trench coat, her face pale and taut with anxiety. She wouldn't look me in the eye. "She's here," Miles said, leaning against the wall, crossing his arms. "Now sign the damn papers." I looked at Alana. "Is this what you wanted, Alana? A life built on stolen blood and fraudulent millions? You think Miles won't do the same thing to you the moment a better opportunity comes along?" "Stop it, Gavin," she whispered, her voice shaking as she stared at the floor. "You were asleep. You were gone. We did what we had to do to survive. Just sign the papers and let us go." "I'm not signing," I said, tossing the Mont Blanc pen onto the bed. Miles's face contorted into rage. He stepped forward, his fists clenching. "You arrogant piece of—" "I don't need to sign. I interrupted, my voice dropping into the calm, authoritative tone I used when dismantling failing portfolios in executive meetings. Because 20 minutes ago, Miles, you checked into the firm's remote server using your home network router to verify the Cayman accounts. And right now, your phone is sitting in that briefcase, routing a secondary master key command from this room. Miles froze. He lunged for the briefcase, tearing his phone out. The screen was flashing a bright crimson warning banner. Security compliance breach. Federal investigative flag initiated. All protocols frozen. "What did you do?" Miles screamed, his thumb frantically tapping the screen. But the biometrics were locked out. The phone had flagged identity conflict and completely shut down. "What the hell did you do, Gavin?" "I ran a risk audit on you," I said, leaning back against the pillows, a cold smile finally reaching my face. The firm's automated security team just flagged a dual login fraud. Within 15 minutes, the federal marshals and the SEC will have a precise GPS triangulation on this exact IP address. Every account you created, every dollar you stole from the firm, and every cent Alana put into those offshore brokerages is frozen. You are legally broke, Miles, and you are criminally exposed. Alana let out a sharp, terrified gasp, dropping her designer handbag onto the floor. "Miles! Miles, what is he talking about? The accounts, my debts!" "Shut up!" Miles roared, turning back to me, his eyes wild with the desperation of a trapped animal. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy, sterile syringe he had clearly taken from Dr. Silas's office downstairs. "It doesn't matter. I'll tell them it was a cyber attack. I'll tell them you did it from your bed. I'll end this right now." He lunged across the bed, pinning my shoulders down with his weight, raising the needle toward the central line in my neck. I was weak from weeks of blood loss, but I wasn't paralyzed anymore. The adrenaline of survival poured through my veins. As Miles drove the needle downward, I brought my right hand up, grabbing his wrist with the final, desperate strength of a man fighting for his literal existence. The sharp tip of the needle hovered bare inches from my skin. "Alana, help me!" Miles shouted, his muscles straining as he tried to force the syringe down. "If he lives, we both go to federal prison for the rest of our lives. Help me!" Alana stood frozen at the foot of the bed, her hands pressed against her mouth, her eyes darting between the two identical men fighting on the mattress. For 7 years, she had lived with me, a man of rules and structure. For 4 months, she had lived with a criminal who offered her a quick fix to her greed. In that split second, she didn't choose love or loyalty or morality. She chose the highest probability of survival. She grabbed the heavy, solid brass desk lamp from the bedside table and swung it with all her might. Crack. The sound echoed through the room. But the blow didn't hit me. Miles stiffened, his eyes rolling back as the heavy brass base struck the side of his skull. The syringe slipped from his fingers, falling harmlessly onto the blankets. He collapsed sideways, crashing onto the hardwood floor, unconscious and bleeding from a deep gash near his temple. Alana dropped the lamp, her hands shaking violently, chest heaving. She looked down at Miles, then up at me, her face a mask of pure terror. "Gavin," she whispered, stepping toward the bed, her hands reaching out in a pathetic, pleading gesture. "Gavin, please. I saved you. I chose you. Tell the police it was all him. Tell them he forced me to do it. We can still unlock the primary accounts if we work together. We can tell them he kidnapped you." I looked at my wife, the woman who had sold my blood to pay for her gambles, the woman who had stood by while I was turned into a living product. I didn't say a word. I reached out, picked up Miles's discarded smartphone, and used my face to unlock the emergency call override. Downstairs, the faint, wailing echo of sirens began to cut through the heavy rhythm of the rain. The Vance and Sterling Corporate Security Division didn't call the local sheriff. They called the Federal White-Collar Task Force, and they had arrived with terrifying efficiency. 10 minutes later, the heavy mahogany door was kicked off its hinges by federal agents in tactical gear. Dr. Silas and his nursing staff were already in handcuffs downstairs, caught attempting to shred patient logs and international wire receipts. An agent with a gold shield stepped into the room, his weapon lowered as he took in the scene. Miles unconscious on the floor, Alana weeping in the corner, and me sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a blanket, looking pale but entirely calm. "Identify yourself," the agent commanded, his eyes shifting between my face and the face of my unconscious twin. I stood up, my legs steady this time, rooted in the absolute certainty of my victory. I reached over to the table, picked up my real corporate ID badge that Miles had left in his briefcase, and handed it to the officer. "My name is Gavin," I said, my voice clear and unbroken. "Senior Credit Risk Manager for Vance and Sterling. The man on the floor is an unauthorized liability, and the woman in the corner is a fraudulent account." The room went completely silent as the agents moved in, securing the plastic zip ties around Alana's wrists and lifting Miles from the floor. Alana didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just stared at me with hollow, dead eyes as she was dragged down the hallway, her high-priced lifestyle crumbling into a permanent federal indictment. A week later, I sat in the executive boardroom at Vance and Sterling. The managing partners sat around the massive mahogany table in absolute silence, watching the digital presentation I had prepared. I had spent the last 7 days completely restructuring the firm's security compliance protocols, tracing every single dollar Miles had attempted to move, and restoring the firm's secondary liquidity funds to the penny. My skin was still a bit pale, and my body was still recovering from the months of physical trauma, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. The senior partner, an older man who had known my father, leaned forward, shaking his head in disbelief. "Gavin, what you went through. It's unprecedented. The audacity of your brother, the betrayal of your wife. We are prepared to offer you a lifetime executive seat and an immediate equity partnership to ensure your loyalty to this firm." I looked around the room, at the wealth, the power, the strict, unyielding structure of the corporate world. For 10 years, I had thought this place was my sanctuary. I thought that by calculating risk, I could protect myself from the chaos of the world. I stood up, closing my laptop, and slid it into my new briefcase. "Thank you, gentlemen," I said quietly, "but I'm declining the partnership. In fact, I'm tendering my resignation effective immediately." The board members exchanged stunned glances. "Resigning? But why? You just proved you're the most valuable asset this firm has." "Because," I said, walking toward the glass doors, looking out over the sprawling, chaotic skyline of Manhattan, "I spent my entire life trying to eliminate risk, and in doing so, I let the people closest to me turn me into a commodity. I don't want to manage liabilities anymore. I want to live." I walked out of the boardroom, leaving the multi-million-dollar offer sitting on the table. For the first time in my life, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a spreadsheet or a risk assessment chart or a financial protocol. As I stepped onto the elevator and the doors closed, cutting off the sound of the trading floor forever, I took a deep breath. My blood was mine again. My name was mine again. And for a man who had been legally dead, there was no greater wealth than that.